Michael Packard might be the luckiest or unluckiest person alive. On the morning of June 11th, 2021, Michael, who was 57 years old at the time, hopped in a boat with his longtime diving partner, Josiah. They took off and headed for the open waters right off the coast of Cape Cod, Massachusetts, where they planned to do some lobster diving. Once they reached this spot right off the coast, Michael put on all of his scuba diving equipment and hopped in the water. Josiah did not put on any diving equipment because he was not going to be getting in the water for this dive. And so just after 6 a.m., once Michael was in the water and signaled he was good to go, he dove down below, and after a little while, he came back up, but with a relatively small haul of lobsters. For the next couple of hours, Michael continued to go down and catch as many lobsters as he possibly could. By 8 a.m., Michael had captured approximately 100 pounds of lobsters that were now in the boat. And so Michael decided he would go back down one more time and try to get just a few more lobsters before they called it a day. And then all of a sudden, this eruption of white water came rushing up to the surface right where Michael had gone down below. After Michael had broken the surface on this final dive down to get more lobsters, he felt something smash into him from behind, and then everything around him went totally pitch black. The impact of whatever it was that hit him had caused his mouthpiece to get blown out of his mouth. So he doesn't have air and he starts fumbling around to find his mouthpiece. His hands are making contact with what feels like walls all around him. He was inside of an enclosed space. But when he had touched these walls, they were not normal walls. They were soft, but they were hard at the same time, and they seemed to be moving, like they were pulsating or quivering. The space he was in was fairly large, and it was not completely flooded with water. He started to notice intense pressure on his legs. Finally, Michael found the line that was connected to his mouthpiece. He jammed it in his mouth, and he took a long inhale, and that's when it dawned on him. He had been swallowed by a whale. For nearly 45 seconds, Michael was trapped inside the closed mouth of a humpback whale. They only eat small fish. So when this particular whale realized Michael was not a tiny fish, it began violently swinging its head side to side to try to dislodge Michael. Michael was spat out of this whale's mouth. Michael made his way to the surface and he flagged down Josiah, who boated over to him. He pulled him back into the boat, and Michael, who was totally traumatized by what happened, could only say to Josiah that he was inside of it and that it tried to eat him. Michael was rushed to a hospital where he was evaluated, and unbelievably, he suffered really no injury. Michael was incredibly casual in all of his interviews about this. He just kind of acted like these things kind of happen, whales come out of nowhere, they just scoop you up, it happens. And he would tell the incredulous reporters who just could not believe this guy was real that as soon as he was better, he was getting back in the water and going lobster diving. You're on vacation in Kentucky and a local blue duck salesman approaches you and says, "Hey, are you interested in buying 5 blue ducks?" "Yeah. Give me all 5. "You fool. It's illegal to purchase less than 6. You're on vacation in Idaho, and a local oversized candy salesman approaches you and says, "Hey, are you interested in buying a 51-pound box of candy for your fiance?" "Yeah. Hit me." "You fool. 50 pounds is the legal limit." You're on vacation in Indiana, and a local horse salesman approaches you and says, "Hey, are you interested in buying a horse that can only run at exactly 11 miles per hour?" "Yeah. Giddy up." "You fool. 10 miles per hour is the legal limit." One day in the summer of 1953, a 30-year-old man named Sam Phillips was cleaning up his recording studio. He was getting ready for his next client. But Sam didn't actually know who his next client would be or when they'd show up. Because he was always on the hunt for new talent to sign, he had opened up his studio to anybody. All they had to do was show up, give him $4, and they could be recorded. This young kid, he was 18 years old, he came strolling inside. He had a guitar slung over his shoulder, and right away he could tell the kid was pretty shy. And the guy came up to him and he just said, "Hey, I work as a truck driver, but I love to sing. I love to play the guitar as a hobby, and I just wanted to come in here and record a couple of ballads for my mom." He's like, "Absolutely. Give me $4 and we can record these ballads." And Sam basically expected this kid to do what most other clients of his did, which was they'd begin playing and be sort of like not that good at their instrument, and they'd sing off key. But with this kid, it was different. Once he began strumming his guitar and singing, it was like he totally broke out of his shell. And so Sam sat there listening to this kid record his ballads and was just so
so blown away by how talented he was. And then when it was all done, he took his recordings with him and he left. And then once he was gone, Sam just made a point to make a note about this kid that just said, "Good ballad singer, save." About a year later, in 1954, Sam was back in his recording studio and he was working with another client. It was this band and they were trying to record some songs. But as they were playing, they decided that they were really lacking another vocalist. And so they asked Sam, like, "Hey, do you know anybody?" Sam's studio manager, who was in the room, immediately chimed in and said, "Hey, Sam, what about that 18-year-old ballad singer from last year? He was great." So he called this young man. The young kid came back to the studio and they began playing together and they sounded terrible. Now, the young man was still very much a great singer. The kid and the band had no chemistry. I mean, they just met each other. And so Sam clearly could see that. And so he said, "Hey guys, for right now, just take a quick break." The band and the kid, they left to go get a drink. And Sam left the booth and went into the control room, which is basically right next door, but does not have a line of sight into the booth. He hears the sound of music being played back in the booth, except the music was different. It was really upbeat. It was fast. It was loud. And Sam could clearly hear the sound of that kid. And so Sam left the control room, ran into the booth. He saw the band and this kid just totally rocking out. It was like they suddenly had amazing chemistry. And Sam is watching this and he's thinking, I have never heard music sound like this before. The sound was sort of a cross between blues and rock and roll. And all Sam could think as he's watching this happen is, the kid, he's the star. That's the person I've been looking for. And so that very night, Sam and this band helped the kid record his first ever single, which was called That's All Right. And once that song hit the airwaves, that kid did become a star. He literally would become one of the most famous musicians to have ever lived. Sam's studio was called Sun Records, and it was located in Memphis, Tennessee. And the young kid was none other than Elvis Presley.
2003, 41-year-old veteran construction worker Ron Hunt was part of a crew that was building a house in Reno, Nevada. Ron knew the first thing he needed to do was drill a couple of large holes in the ceiling of one of the rooms in this house. As soon as he got to the job site that morning, he climbed up the ladder a couple of steps and began punching holes in the ceiling with this drill. But when he got down and moved the ladder to another section of this room, when he got up there, he could not get the drill to go through the ceiling. He knew there was nothing behind the ceiling that would stop the drill from going through. He decided he just needed a little bit of extra leverage. He walked to the very top of the ladder, the dangerous section you're not supposed to stand on. He lines up this drill. He begins squeezing the trigger and at the same time pushes with all that extra leverage. He feels the drill starting to go into the wood that he's not realizing he's pushing down with his feet. And at some point he pushes too hard and he causes the ladder to spill out from underneath him. Ron tried to throw the drill away from him, but he wasn't able to throw the drill far enough away from him. The drill, when it hit the ground, landed on its back with the drill pointing straight up into the air. When he fell down face first, his right eye socket landed directly on the drill. This 18-inch long, 1.5-inch in diameter drill bit goes right through his eyeball, through his skull, and punctures out the back of his head. But he's conscious. He just reaches up with his hands and he feels the base of this drill and he feels it going into his eye, and then he feels around the back of his head and the rest of the drill coming out of his skull. And at that point, he just starts screaming. The only other worker on the job site at the time was this man named Forrest. He hears Ron screaming, and so he runs over and he sees Ron, who's now standing up, cradling the drill base. And Forrest, he can't believe Ron is even alive. He rips his shirt off, runs over to Ron, and kind of wraps it around his head to try to control the bleeding a little bit. And then he tells Ron to stay where he is. And then Forrest ran about 1,000 feet away to the nearest house, and he was able to use their phone to call paramedics. The paramedics arrive, they go over, and they detach the drill base from the drill bit. So all that's left is the actual 18-inch rod that's been pushed through his head. And then they take Ron via ambulance to a local hospital, and from there, they actually fly him in a helicopter to a bigger hospital that can handle this kind of injury. They rush him to the operating room. The surgeons decided their best bet was just to unscrew the bit from his head. And so they gave him some morphine, and then over the next couple of hours, the doctors slowly twisted this piece of metal until it finally unwound itself out of his skull. Ron, who was so high on painkillers, was cracking jokes. Ron would survive. The worst thing that happened to him is he lost the sight in his right eye. The surgeons would tell Ron that the only reason he didn't die or get paralyzed is because when that drill bit went into his skull, it kind of pressed his brain aside as it passed through. 1974, 31-year-old Michael Taylor was living happily with his wife Christine and their 5 children in in Ossett, a small town in central England. Michael had been doing some home repairs when he fell off of a ladder and he hurt his back. Michael went from being this happy guy to being sad and depressed when one of Michael's friends approached Michael and said that he really ought to check out this one particular Christian group. The real draw was the group's leader. Her name was Marie Robinson. She could help him get back to normal. Michael makes his way to the church, and as soon as they see Michael coming in the room, they say, "Come on, come sit down with us." Marie, she stands up, huge smile on her face. Michael, for the first time in ages, is smiling, but when the meeting was over and Michael went back home again, the pain and depression came flooding back. Over the next couple of weeks, Michael became very close with Marie, and Marie became very close with Michael. Before long, Christine, Michael's wife, was hearing from a friend Michael was having an affair with Marie. Christine waited until Michael had left the house to head out to one of the group meetings, hopped in her car, and she followed him to the church. Barges in, and she points at her husband and she says, "I know you're having an affair with Marie." He stands up and looks at Marie, and when Marie made eye contact with Michael, she screamed. He began breaking out in tongues. Michael goes from just barking in strange languages at Marie to suddenly rushing across the room as if he's going to attack her. The members jump on top of him and hold him down, and then Marie suddenly breaks out into tongues too. The group is just totally dumbfounded, so they just begin praying. And then after about an hour, Michael just collapses. Michael would claim he had no memory of what had just happened. At this point, Marie would tell him that she believed Michael was possessed by a demonic force. The only thing they could do would be to perform an exorcism. The Anglican Church of England sent out two of their best exorcists named Peter and Raymond. A day later, they would all meet at this other church. Peter and Raymond began the ritual by praying. Michael began screaming out in tongues as if the words Peter and Raymond were saying were harming Michael. After 8 hours, they finally just came to a stop. Peter and Raymond, they tell him, "We identified 40 demons inside of you and was able to expel 37 of them. Go home. Tomorrow we will finish this exorcism." A few hours later, a woman who lived near Michael Taylor thought she heard something strange, and outside, walking down the street completely naked, covered in blood, was Michael Taylor. The police show up and they find Michael, and he was giggling like a child in the fetal position. A few hours earlier, when Michael and his wife had come home, Michael had fallen into one of his trances and began beating his wife. Fortunately, their 5 children were not home at the time of this attack. During Michael's trial, the prosecution and the defense blamed the Anglican Church of England and Marie and her religious group for convincing Michael he was possessed with demons, which caused him to act out violently and kill his wife. In 2019, 21-year-old Samantha Josephson was a senior at the University of South Carolina. She was a brilliant student who aspired to be a lawyer. She wanted to practice international law. She needed to be able to speak other languages besides English. And so during her college years, she had really leaned into Spanish. One of her professors was a woman named Daniela Jaimes. Daniela offered to Samantha to kind of be there for her if she needed anything beyond just Spanish, that she was there to help her with law school applications or if she needed advice on something. And by 2019, in Samantha's senior year, the pair had become very close. On March 29th, Samantha decided to go out with her friends for some drinks. So she, along with her friends, head out to this downtown area called 5 Points, which is right near the University of South Carolina. And then around 2 a.m., the group found themselves in a bar called Bird Dog. The group of friends got separated. Samantha decided that she was just too tired and didn't really feel like staying out any longer. And so she texted her friends and let them know that she was going to head back to her room. She hops in an Uber and she starts driving back towards her campus. Several hours later, they realized Samantha was not in her room. They called the police and reported her missing. At the same time that Samantha was reported missing, there were these 2 men who were in their mid-20s that were located 70 miles to the east of the University of South Carolina. They were out in this forest and they were hunting for turkeys. These 2 men, whose names were Anders and Ryan, they had had no luck actually finding these birds. Around 4:30 p.m., Anders, he finally is just ready to admit defeat and leave empty-handed. Something catches his eye off to the left behind some trees, and when he got a full look at this thing, he yelled for Ryan. As Ryan is running into the forest, Anders is pulling his phone out and calling the police. And then the police officers walk into the forest, and before long, they're looking down at Samantha. 14 hours before, Samantha left the Bird Dog bar and walked out front, and she hailed an Uber. Except that was not an Uber car. That was a car driven by a 24-year-old named Nathaniel Rowland. He was a guy who had been driving around 5 Points all night to try to trick people into getting into his vehicle, believing it was an Uber. She couldn't get out again because the doors were child locked. Nathaniel drove Samantha to some isolated area, most likely 70 miles to the east, near that forested area where her body was found. And then once he parked, Nathaniel pulled out a knife and then leapt into the back seat of his car, and he stabbed her 120 times. It would take Samantha over 10 minutes to finally die. Nathaniel was arrested within 24 hours of the discovery of Samantha's body. While he never offered any motive for the crime, it's believed he simply decided that night he was going to go kill someone. Nathaniel was ultimately convicted of her murder and was sentenced to life in prison. Here are the final images of Samantha as she climbs into Nathaniel's car.
On Thursday, June 6th, 2013, a 79-year-old woman named Marilyn Walpole, along with her husband Jim, walked down a busy street in Toronto, Canada. They were on their way back to their hotel after a dinner date at a local Irish pub called PJ O'Brien. The couple was from Ohio, but they were on the last leg of a cross-country vacation through Canada, and at some point, as they're walking on the sidewalk, they see up ahead there's all this scaffolding. They walk underneath the scaffolding, but at some point, Jim trips, and where he lands is where there's a couple pieces of metal kind of poking up out of the ground, some metal tubing. And so Jim, he hits the ground, and the tube cuts his neck wide open. And so suddenly Jim is literally gushing blood all over the sidewalk. There are these two men who don't know each other. They're just strangers out on the street. They hear Marilyn screaming for help, and these two guys come running over to her, and one of the men pulls out his phone and calls 911. And the other man, he got down next to Jim, he pulled the scarf off from around his neck, and he cradled Jim's head, and he wrapped the scarf around Jim's neck, and he applied pressure. And very calmly, he told Jim, "It's okay, we're stopping the bleeding, paramedics are on their way." He tells Marilyn, "Everything's gonna be fine." And then after Jim was lifted up by paramedics and put into the back of the ambulance, Marilyn was told, "Hey, get in, you're coming with him." And as she's climbing into the ambulance, she turns and specifically asks the man who was kind of all over it, who was actually handling Jim. She said, "What's your name?" And the man looked at her and he just said, "My name's John." And she said, "Thank you so much." She hops in the ambulance and they take off to the hospital. The following day, Marilyn was in her husband's hospital room, feeling very grateful that Jim was clearly going to survive here. So ultimately, he had broken a finger and also needed 10 stitches to his neck. So this was a very close call. And the doctors told them that, because of the quick action of John and the other man who called 911, that very likely contributed to stabilizing him enough and be saved. Marilyn is determined that she needs to find these two men and thank them. But luckily, the following day, when Marilyn and Jim were back at their hotel, they got a call from the front desk saying that they had a visitor. And it would turn out it was the man who had called 911. He had been really concerned about Jim and Marilyn and wanted to figure out if they were okay, and he had discovered where they were staying, and so he had come to see them. Marilyn and Jim, they come down and they're so thankful, and they come to find out this guy is actually the owner of PJ O'Brien's pub, where they had gone to eat on the night Jim had fallen. And then also Marilyn's like, "Do you know the other guy, John?" And the owner of the pub, he sort of looked back at Marilyn with a smile on his face, and he's like, "Well, I don't know him personally. We just happened to be walking down the street when you called out for help, but I know who John is." Lots of people know who John is. John has this skill. He's this really charismatic, really commanding presence where every time he's in a room, people just look to him and think, "Oh, he's got to be in charge." And he carries that X factor on screen. Every role this guy plays in movies and TV shows, he is the leader. And so from that day forward, Marilyn and Jim had a brand new favorite actor, John Malkovich, a multi-time award-winning actor who literally saved Jim's life.
In 2004, there was this guy named Mitch who was going to a university in Louisiana. There's this girl in his class named Kayla, and he just loves this girl. He wants to date her more than anything, and he's tried several times to woo her, but she's not that interested. She's kind of playing hard to get. And eventually, she does kind of acquiesce and say, "Okay, let's go on a date." And they hit it off. And they end up graduating, and after graduation, they get married. And by 2006, Mitch and Kayla have bought their dream home, and Mitch is at this dream home. He's sitting on the couch watching football, but at some point, he notices something odd about this lamp. For some reason, the lamp itself was blurry. And he's like, "Okay,
okay, I don't know what this is about, but he does the typical kind of dude reaction, like, whatever. And then at some point, the lamp is now turned upside down. So now Mitch is looking at this lamp thinking, okay, huge problems here. There's something wrong. So that night, they put the kids to bed, and Kayla and Mitch, they go to bed too. But then after Kayla had fallen asleep, Mitch is wide awake, and there's something telling him to go down and look at that lamp. And so Mitch sneaks downstairs, and the light is not even on at this point, but even in the darkness, he can tell it's still blurry, it's still upside down. Now, in addition to being upside down and blurry, the lamp begins to grow inside the room. And so as it's growing, it's taking up more and more of this field of vision until this lamp is so big, he now is basically consumed by the lamp. And it's at this point that he begins to feel this blinding pain in his head, and he doesn't know where it's coming from. And then he hears a ringing in his ears, and then all he hears is just people screaming everywhere. And it's total darkness, the lamp is gone, and then he opens his eyes and he looks around, and he's surrounded by a sea of people that are all looking at him, and he's on the ground. It's broad daylight, he's not at his house anymore. A police officer comes charging through the circle, and he grabs Mitch, and without saying anything, he lifts him up, a grown man, and just runs with him to his police car. And the whole time, Mitch is like, where's my wife and kids? What's going on? And the police officer was like, sir, you just hit your head. I'm bringing you to the hospital. And so ultimately, he discovers what's actually happened. Mitch was a senior in college, and he got tackled by a football player, and he hit his head on the ground, and he was unconscious for a fraction of a second. And in those seconds, his brain constructed an entire life with a wife, with kids, with the white picket fence, the house. None of it existed. He never had a wife. He never had his kids. They are not real. And so he had to grieve the loss of people who never existed, and it wrecked his life. I was one of the first people in my platoon that got sent to Afghanistan. A grenade detonated next to me and the people I was with. And I remember distinctly thinking, please let the grenade detonate below my head so that it'll kill me, but it won't blow my head off, and that at least my family will be able to identify me. Again, this happened in like a split second, but it's like it hits my shoulder, and then it fell down towards the ground. And as it followed down my body, I'm like, okay, good. Maybe it'll hit my legs, and it'll just take my legs out. It hits the ground, and when it detonated, it just felt like someone took a big handful of rocks and just like threw it at the back of my legs and my back. I was basically down on the ground, bleeding to death, and my medic, who's also a SEAL, he was the only guy who was not directly injured by the frag of the grenade. He was concussed. He literally saved my life. He dragged me to cover as much as we could, and he literally laid over me and put my tourniquets on, and he was like so calm. You know, he's like, hey, it's gonna be fine. Like literally wrapped the train for it. Wow. Crazy. One day in 1785, a woman writhed in pain in a hospital bed at the Royal Infirmary of Edinburgh. And surrounding her on all sides were all these nurses. This woman was in labor, and she'd been in labor for several hours, and so far, it was not going well. The staff determines that her baby's skull is so big that the baby is not able to exit her body. The baby is stuck in her birth canal. Back in 1785, C-sections did exist, but they were extremely dangerous to the mother. It was basically a death sentence for the mother. And at some point, one of the nurses left the room, and a couple of minutes later, she came back with this gray-haired surgeon. And he just says, everything's gonna be fine because I have a brand new piece of technology that's gonna save your lives. Dr. John Aitken was one of the leading doctors at this hospital. And so when he kind of explained this piece of technology to this totally distraught woman who can barely focus, she's relieved and she's like, thank you, thank you, thank you. And then Dr. John Aitken, he leaves the room, and when he comes back, he's now carrying this instrument. And suddenly the woman, when she sees the instrument, she goes from being relieved to being downright horrified. The staff literally held her down, basically strapped her to the bed, and then Dr. John Aitken said, okay, here we go, and he turns on this instrument, and this woman, she's already in blinding pain, but when he begins to apply this instrument to her body, the pain somehow becomes even worse, and then suddenly, when it feels like it literally can't get any worse than this, it all kind of fades for a second, and she hears this sound that she did not expect to hear. It was the sound of a baby crying. Her baby had just been successfully extracted from her stomach. And amazingly, she was okay too. So the procedure that this woman underwent was known as a symphysiotomy. And the procedure itself had been around since, the 17th century. This was a procedure used when a baby got stuck in the birth canal. And the way this procedure worked is they would go in and sever the joint called the pubic symphysis, which connects the left and right pelvis bones. This piece of technology made the symphysiotomy basically more targeted and more efficient. Smaller incision, much faster and a higher success rate. And so despite the fact that Aitken's invention sort of looked really barbaric, it caught on very quickly and sort of became the standard, and it would remain that way until about the turn of the 20th century, which is when C-sections became much safer, which meant the need for symphysiotomies decreased dramatically, and so basically this tool sort of faded into obscurity until another group, completely unrelated to medicine, found a very specific use for this instrument, and that group were lumberjacks. They found that this tool was also really good at cutting down trees. The device that Dr. John Aitkins invented for medicine was actually just a chainsaw. At 11:40 a.m. on November 29th, 1986, a 36-year-old volunteer fire chief named Jack Schofstall parked his fire truck on a country road right next to this huge farm in rural Indiana. Jack was there with his assistant chief named Donald Schnitker, and he saw the owner of this farm, Jeffrey Wolf, was standing on the side of the road, waving to them and turning around and pointing back towards his property, and they saw there was this huge storage building off in the distance, and there appeared to be this thin plume of smoke, and the three of them jog across the property over to this building. This storage building was packed to the brim with stuff. Really, the only way to actually look inside of this building to see what was burning is by climbing up this ladder that ran to the top of this 80-foot tall building, where at the very top there was a window that looked down into the storage building. And so basically Jack and Jeff said they would climb the ladder up to the top. Donald, the assistant chief, he would stay on the ground so they could make a decision about how to approach this. And so Jack and Jeff, they make their way up this ladder to the very top. They get to this window, and Jack, he looks inside, but he can't tell where it's coming from. It's just there's so much stuff inside of this building. Jeffrey clearly had placed this big piece of plywood on the very top of all the stuff inside of the storage building, and so Jack climbed through the window, and so he gets on there, and as he's looking around, he identifies where this fire is coming from. And so Jack, who's still standing on this piece of plywood, he pulls out his radio, and he radios down to Donald, the assistant chief, who's down on the ground, and he says, "We located the fire, we're gonna come back down, get our equipment, we'll come back up here, we'll put this thing out." But after Jack put the radio back on his belt, before he got off the plywood, there was this low rumbling sound that came from right underneath his feet. At the same time, Donald, who's back down on the ground, he hasn't seen either of them come out of this building. And so Donald grabs his radio and begins repeatedly calling Jack, but he didn't get an answer. Donald began calling for help, and very quickly, an entire fleet of additional firefighters and police officers and ambulances showed up. First responders climbed up that ladder, and they figured out what happened. So when Jack climbed through that window at the top of this building, and he stood on top of that piece of plywood, that rumbling under his feet was all the stuff underneath the plywood shifting, and he sort of lost his balance, and Jack fell off the plywood into basically this sea of stuff. And Jeffrey, when he saw this happen, he had not fallen in, but he turned and basically tried to get in there and grab on to Jack to get him out, but he too inadvertently fell into what was inside of this building. And what was inside of this building was corn. This was an 80-foot tall grain silo. And so when Jack fell into the grain, it was like it swallowed him whole like quicksand. And then Jeffrey, in an attempt to save Jack, also fell in, got swallowed whole, and they disappeared and suffocated. It would ultimately take nearly 3 hours for bulldozers to basically break apart this building and sift through all the corn to finally locate Jack and Jeffrey. At 2 a.m. on December 2nd, 1755, a 94-year-old man named Henry Hall slowly climbed a flight of stairs inside of a lighthouse off the southwest coast of England. Even though Henry was in his 90s, he was still working as a lighthouse keeper. The other two lighthouse keepers that were staying on this island with Henry, they were passed out drunk in their beds. This is in 1755, so this is before electricity. And so the light that was coming out of this lighthouse were literally a whole bunch of candles that were situated in this big chandelier that kind of hung down from the very top of the spire. And then above, where the candles are all resting in the chandelier, was this big dome that was the very top of the lighthouse. And the dome was lined with lead. The lead sort of reflected all the light and pushed all the light out all the windows. They had to go up to the lantern room and make sure all the candles were lit. Doing these every 30-minute checks of the candles was completely routine. As he's making his way up the stairs, he starts to smell smoke, and clearly some of the soot that was caked on the underside of this dome was starting to smolder. Henry decided the best thing for him to do was to open up a window. But when he does, it creates a vacuum effect, and all this air gets pulled into the lantern room, and the dome just ignites into flames. There was this balcony that jutted outside of the actual lighthouse. And so he stepped out onto this balcony, he turned and could look up, and basically right in front of him is the roof, and it's on fire. And out on this balcony were all these buckets to collect rainwater. So one by one, he's chucking the water up on the roof, and here's his two colleagues come bounding up the stairs, and all three of them are now grabbing buckets. And then finally, Henry grabbed one last bucket, and he chucked the water right onto the roof. He suddenly felt this blinding pain come over his whole body, and his colleagues, they look at him, and they see he's smoldering. There's smoke coming off of him, and they're dousing Henry with water. He just blurts out to them, "We gotta get out of here." And so the three of them, they abandon the buckets, and they bolt out of the lighthouse, and they make their way to a cave on the coast of this island. And luckily, there was a ship on the horizon that spotted this smoldering ruin of the lighthouse, and they came in, they scooped the three men up, and they brought them back to mainland England. Henry's two younger co-workers made sure to help get Henry to his home, and then when he was there, they called for a doctor, because Henry was still complaining about this really intense feeling in his stomach, and the doctor told him, like, look, I don't know exactly what that pain is from, but very likely when you were right near the fire, you were inhaling a lot of smoke. So for the next several days, he got worse, and then finally, 12 days after the fire, Henry died. The doctor decided to perform an autopsy on Henry. It would turn out, during the fire, he looked up as he was throwing the water, and his mouth was open, and at the same time he did that, a piece of molten lead from the dome dripped down and fell into his mouth, and then cooled and hardened in his stomach. Today, that same piece of lead is actually on display at the National Museum of Scotland. On the afternoon of September 27th, 1956, a 13-year-old boy named Neary Morgan was walking with his two younger brothers through a desert in South Australia called Maralinga. Neary and his brothers were members of an isolated Aboriginal tribe called the Martu, and they were out to hunt kangaroos for their family. They had been tracking this particular group of kangaroos, and every time the brothers got ready to strike, the kangaroos would take off. This group of kangaroos stopped at a watering hole, which was just a few dozen yards away from them. The brothers knew this was their chance. These kangaroos were going to stay here long enough that they could strike. They got down in the brush and began advancing on the kangaroos. After only taking a few steps, they heard this loud rumbling sound off in the distance. The sky suddenly was illuminated impossibly bright, to the point where Neary is shielding his eyes to just see what's going on. This extremely hot gust of wind came blasting through and knocked the brothers onto the ground, totally disorienting them. And then from the ground, Neary kind of turns his head and he happens to look in the direction where the kangaroos were. Then he sees them literally floating in the air, coming right over to him and then dropping on the ground. And then a moment later, it was like everything just went back to normal. Except now they're looking at this bounty right in front of them, all these kangaroos, and they're thinking, what's just happened here was a gift from God. And so eventually, Neary and his brothers began lifting up these kangaroos and carrying as many as they could back to their tribe. That night, the tribe had this big celebration, and they ate all this kangaroo meat. I mean, it was incredible. But then the next day, when the tribe woke up, everybody who had eaten any of that kangaroo was violently sick. Vomiting, rashes all over their body, aches, pain, and over the next few days, some people did recover, but a lot of others did not. And soon, people from this tribe began dying. And so naturally, Neary and the other members of the tribe did make the connection that very likely whatever was happening here was tied to consuming that kangaroo meat. This whole event remained a mystery until 11 years later, when Neary was 24 years old. It would turn out all those dead kangaroos were not the result of God giving them a gift. Instead, the reason that happened was because of a big scientific experiment that was conducted in Maralinga in total secrecy. The British government was testing nuclear bombs. Neary and his brothers had been a few kilometers away from a detonation site, and where they were positioned was right at that perfect separation point. Neary and brothers just barely safe, kangaroos just barely in the lethal zone. And the meat was not only devastated from the blast, but it was also littered with radiation. The members of the tribe who ate the kangaroo meat immediately got radiation sickness and began to die. An unknown number of people died from these nuclear bomb tests, and it would take 11 years before the British government would come in and begin cleaning up the nuclear waste. The Australian government ultimately paid $13.5 million in compensation to Aboriginal tribes that were affected by these tests. As for Neary, he survived, and today he's actually in his 80s, and he continues to tell his story to younger generations.
In 1964, during his final semester of college in Wisconsin, a 21-year-old man named Harry decided to take an acting class. He believed it would be an easy A, but he also realized he he loved acting. And so after he graduates later that year, he and his girlfriend get married, and then they fly out to Hollywood, California, where Harry auditions for Columbia Pictures' New Talent program. He signs a contract with them that pays him almost nothing. And right away, they start shopping him around for different parts in TV shows and movies, but nobody is interested in Harry. 2 years after he and his wife had arrived in Hollywood, he was offered a speaking role in a movie, although it was a very minor role. And so after Harry goes over to the studio and he films this whole scene and it's all done, one of the producers that was in charge of this New Talent program, he calls Harry over, and the guy looks at him and says, "Look, I just gotta shoot you straight here. You're not gonna make it in Hollywood. You're not gonna be a movie star." When Tony Curtis was told to carry groceries across this room in one of his first movies, everybody knew right away, that guy, he's gonna be a movie star. You could see it. And when you did your scene as the bellhop walking around the hotel, I just didn't see it. Harry, after getting this horrible comment made about him, and then he leans across the table and looks at this producer and squints his eyes and says, "You know, if Tony was such a good actor, shouldn't we have believed he was just a grocery delivery boy, not a movie star?" The producer fired Harry on the spot. Harry would go on to sign a similar New Talent program deal with Universal Studios, but again, he could not get a real part to save his life. By the mid-1970s, Harry was in his mid-30s, and while he still aspired to be an actor and wanted to be an actor, he was going to become a carpenter. That was going to be his full-time job. And before long, Harry was dubbed the Carpenter to the Stars. In 1976, Harry was a full-fledged carpenter and had been for about a year when one of his very close friends named Fred Roos, who was a casting director and film producer, gave him a call and told him he had a very unique opportunity for him. This is like, put yourself in a good position and maybe somebody will discover you're as talented as you really are. And so after Fred stopped explaining this situation, Harry was actually kind of annoyed. He was being asked to go read lines but not even try out. So how was this even an opportunity? And so Harry goes to this audition, he's handed the script, and he's reminded repeatedly to not attempt to audition. And he's trying to do what they told him to do, but the way he was actually feeling and his actual personality began seeping through. He started coming off as this really grumpy and sarcastic guy that just didn't care about anybody there. Apparently, this is exactly what the director was looking for in one of the characters he was trying to cast. The film director, better known as George Lucas, walks up to Harry, better known as Harrison Ford, and says, "Wait a minute, you are perfect for this movie, Star Wars." And so Harrison Ford said, "All right, I'll play Han Solo." On the evening of June 24th, 1986, a 10-year-old boy named Juan Pedro Martinez Gomez bounced around in his seat in the cab of his father's big red tractor-trailer truck. As a reward for doing so well in school, Juan's father had surprised Juan and Juan's mom with this particular trip. Their plan was to drive from their hometown in southeastern Spain all the way across the country to the northern coast. Juan's dad would offload the cargo. Juan and his mom and dad would stick around and kind of make a vacation out of it. And Juan's dad began backing the truck up so it could be paired up with the cargo he'd be hauling to the north coast. It was this huge 25,000 liter tanker, and so once they were all hooked up, he turned onto the road and began heading towards the stretch of mountain road called the Somosierra Mountain Pass. About 40 minutes later, a man who was also driving in the Somosierra Mountain Pass, when suddenly a huge red tractor trailer truck came barreling toward him from behind, and the truck smashed into this guy, which sent his car careening off the road. And so this guy's car comes to a stop, and the guy, he kind of comes to, and he climbed out of his car, and there was the truck that had hit him. It was now on its side, and it was hissing steam, and it didn't look like anybody inside the truck was trying to get out. This white van came blazing around the corner, and this woman with blonde hair jumped out, and she said, "I'm a nurse, do you need any help?" And she did not seem like a nurse. And he saw the driver looked oddly similar to the woman, except it was a man who was driving, and then in the passenger seat was this elderly woman who was just staring daggers at this guy. And so the guy finally just said, "I don't need any help, go help them." And the van sped to where the crashed big red tractor trailer truck was, and she climbed on top of it, and she reached down and she took something out of the truck. But from his perspective, 100 feet back, he couldn't tell what she had taken out of the cab. She climbed off the cab, she did not attempt to help anybody inside of the truck, and the white van sped off down the road. When help arrived, emergency responders immediately realized they had an environmental disaster on their hands. The big red tractor-trailer truck, which was Juan's father's truck, was hauling 25,000 liters of sulfuric acid. When emergency crews were able to go up to the truck and look inside, they discovered that the vehicle's occupants were all dead. However, there were only 2 bodies. It was Juan's mother and father. Juan was nowhere to be found. Missing person posters of Juan went up all over Spain. 1 year after the crash, a driving instructor in Madrid, Spain, heard a knock on the door. He found there was this elderly woman who appeared to be blind, and with her was a young boy who appeared to be about 11 years old. The driving instructor, he just couldn't help but feel like there was something oddly familiar about these 2 people. The driving instructor asked them, how can I help you? The little boy, he asked in perfect Spanish, where's the U.S. Embassy? At this exact moment, he remembered seeing him on all those missing person posters. And so the driving instructor, he goes, hold on a minute, and he finds one of the posters. He grabbed it and he ran back out to show it to them, but the boy and the blind old woman were gone. To this day, he's still missing and his case is still unsolved.
This is why you should always check under your bed for monsters. In 2012, a young woman walks downstairs to the lobby of her apartment building, collects her mail, and then heads back up to her room. She sits on her bed to start sifting through the mail when she drops her phone and it falls under the bed. She lies down on the ground to try to reach her arm out to grab her phone when she notices something horrible underneath her bed. A man is lying underneath her bed with his back to her. He's in the fetal position. She manages not to scream. She grabs her phone and says to her boyfriend, hey, I gotta go shower, I'll call you back. And she quickly runs into the bathroom, locks the door, turns on the shower, and then jumps out her first floor window. Once she's safely across the street, she calls the police, who quickly arrive, and they go inside and they come out with a deranged, skinny-looking man. Before they take him away, one of the officers walks over to her with a very grim look on his face. He looks at her and he just says, we found him standing outside of your bathroom holding a knife. He was waiting for you.
In 1994, an 11-year-old named Mark arrived at summer camp and made his way over to the dining hall where the director was going to talk about the next couple of weeks. The director emphasized that no one was allowed to swim out to the dock located way out in the middle of the lake, although she didn't say why. Mark and the 3 other boys in his cabin were so intrigued by this faraway dock that the next day during lunch, while everyone was eating, they hopped in the lake and started swimming out. When they finally got out to the dock, they were a little bit let down because it looked like any other dock. But they decide to make the best of it. They climb on top and they start playing the game where they all stand on one side until it floods. Last one to fall off wins. As the corner sank, they started to hear a scratching sound coming from underneath the dock. Suddenly, hundreds of these big meaty spiders come crawling out through the breaks in the wood and slide down the slanted dock towards the boys, who panic and fall forward, and there's spiders swarming their hair and their face. Turns out the dock was off limits because it was overrun with dock spiders, and the boys flooded their nest. In 2017, 2 16-year-olds were in their school bathroom when the lights suddenly went out and their school went into lockdown. Feeling rebellious, they decide, you know what, let's go explore the school a little bit first, and then we'll go follow procedure. They step out of the bathroom and look down the hall towards their classroom, and they see this large figure standing in front of their classrooms. It's definitely not a student, it's not a teacher. He's got ragged clothes on and he starts walking towards them. They dart right back into the bathroom to the corner stall where they hide, praying that that man didn't see them. The man bursts in and starts yanking open all the stalls. Not wanting to see what happens when he gets to their stall, they get on the ground and start crawling to the side of the room, where they finally get up and make a run for the door. They look back and he's holding a gun. The boys manage to get away safely and no one's hurt, but the police never capture the ragged man. 62-year-old Russian ambassador Andrei Karlov was ushered into a famous art museum in Turkey. There, Andrei was going to deliver a speech at the opening of an exhibition of Turkish photography that featured the Russian countryside. Andrei had been a Russian government employee for the past 40 years, spending much of his time in North Korea, but in 2013 he took this post as the ambassador to Turkey. Although he was a seasoned diplomat, he knew there was a lot riding on this visit. His appearance there was following several days of protests by Turks against Russian involvement in the Syrian civil war. Andrei was there to ease the strain in Turkish-Russian relations as officials from both countries met to broker a ceasefire in Syria. As Andrei made his way across the room, he had a lot of things on his mind, but one thing he wasn't concerned about was his own safety. The museum had state-of-the-art security cameras, and everyone who was going to be attending his speech had been carefully screened and vetted. Andrei was also protected by his own personal bodyguards that were these men in dark suits that fanned out around him as he stepped up to the microphone. The bodyguard who stood directly behind him was 22-year-old Melvit Altuntaş. He was a Turkish native who for 2.5 years had served on an elite riot police unit, and over the past year, he had been asked 8 separate times to be on the personal security detail of the Turkish president. Andre looked down at the podium at his notes, and then he looked up at the room that was filled with journalists and dignitaries, and he composed himself, he cleared his voice, and he began to speak. Behind him, Mevlut, the bodyguard, opened his jacket slightly and continued staring at the back of Andre's head. And then in one swift motion, he drew a pistol and fired 3 shots into the ambassador's back. And then when the ambassador fell to the ground, Mevlut moved on top of him and fired 4 more shots, killing him. Guests started screaming and running for cover. Meanwhile, Mevlut pointed his finger into the sky and yelled, "Do not forget Aleppo, do not forget Syria." And then he began walking around the exhibit, smashing the pictures on the wall before Turkish security forces showed up. There was a gunfight and Mevlut was killed. It would turn out Mevlut was not a part of Andrei Karlov's security detail. He was actually off duty, but had used his police credentials to get into the exhibit hall. His exact motive for the assassination is unclear. Some think it was revenge for Russia's targeting of rebel-held areas in Aleppo. Others say the shooting was designed to disrupt warming relations between Turkey and Russia. But regardless of why it happened, what the world remembers from this event is the award-winning photograph that was taken of Mevlut immediately after he committed the attack. Here is that photo.
On a spring afternoon in 1883, a young woman named Sarah tidied up her farmhouse in a tiny settlement called Eagle Creek in Arizona. While Sarah cleaned, her sister Elizabeth took a bucket outside to get water from their outdoor spring. So Sarah and Elizabeth actually lived together in this farmhouse along with their respective families. The American West at this time was sparsely populated and dangerous, so it was not uncommon for families to kind of band together like this. And so on this day, as Elizabeth was out getting water, when all of a sudden, the family's dogs began barking really aggressively, and she quickly went outside onto the porch to see what the dogs were barking at. She suddenly saw the massive 4-legged creature with red fur, and its back was all twisted up, and on the back of this creature was this man. His face was horrible and sunken, and his mouth was in this huge grin. Instinctively, she just turned, bolted inside the house, barricaded the door with the kitchen table, and then rounded up the 4 kids and sat in the kitchen, huddled over them. But as she was doing this, Sarah suddenly heard this blood-curdling scream come from somewhere outside. Her sister was out there getting water. That scream almost certainly came from her sister, her and Elizabeth's husbands. They had come back from herding the sheep, and they're calling into her like, "Hey, what's going on here? Let us in." And so the 2 husbands are immediately so concerned. They have no idea about the validity of the story, but Elizabeth is gone. They have to go find her. As they're calling out for Elizabeth and not getting a response, they just took off running. And as they turned the corner and they finally saw the spring, they also saw Elizabeth. She was dead. And so as Elizabeth's husband wept over Elizabeth's body, Sarah's husband rode off into town to get the local coroner to come out and investigate. When he examined the hoof prints that were all over the place, they were way too big to be a horse's hoof print. A decade after Elizabeth's death, this farmer happened to look out his window, and there, standing in his turnip patch, was the so-called red ghost. He grabbed his rifle and he fired, and the red ghost crumpled to the ground right in the middle of the turnip patch. It would turn out the red ghost was not the devil riding some supernatural monster. Instead, the red ghost had red fur, a long neck, and a humped back. It was a camel. But this camel alone was not responsible for scaring the people of Arizona. What terrified the people of Arizona and created the legend of the red ghost was the rider of the camel. There was a person on the back of that camel. The devil on the back of the camel was a man's decomposing corpse. And because he was a decomposing corpse, his flesh and eyes had rotted from his face. We don't know who this man was or how exactly he died. All we know is he was riding this camel escaped, and then this camel just roamed around Arizona for years with this corpse on its back.
You're on vacation in Illinois and a local salamander dealer comes up to you and he says, "Hey, can I interest you in buying 76 salamanders?" And you're like, "Actually, that sounds pretty good. I can get a lot done with 76 salamanders. Give me all 76. You fool. 75 is the legal limit. On the last day of your tobogganing trip to South Dakota, you're feeling tired, and so you decide to avoid the slopes that day and hit up the local cheese factory and take a tour. You get inside, you start feeling sleepy, and you decide, you know what, this is a good place to take a nap, and so you do. You fool.
It's illegal to nap in cheese factories in South Dakota. It's nighttime and you've just arrived in New Hampshire for the National Spelunking Championship, and you're totally stressed about the competition the next day. So you go down to the beach to collect yourself, clear your mind, and you notice a huge amount of seaweed on the beach, and you think, maybe I should collect this, and so you do. You fool. You can't collect seaweed at night in New Hampshire.
It's almost a cop-out to say paranormal doesn't exist, only because all you have to do is just zoom out. Zoom out a little bit on our species. Zoom out a little bit on Earth. It doesn't matter what you think of how we got here, or whether there's God, or whatever your interpretation of existence and our place in it, doesn't matter. It is undeniably the case that we are this little tiny thing in this vast space that we don't really understand. Even through every religion, we don't really know with absolute clarity who we are and what we're doing here. And so because of that, why is it so outlandish to think that there could be supernatural activity? From the outside, Bart Whitaker appeared to love his family. Bart's family would regularly go on vacation to places like Cancun, and the pictures of Bart with his family on these vacations are always him beaming with happiness and love for his family. On December 10th, 2003, Bart, who was 23, almost 24 years old at the time, told his family that he had just finished taking his final exams of his senior year at nearby Sam Houston State College, and that he was going to graduate. Bart was not a natural student and frankly struggled in college. This was a really big announcement, and the family was really excited for him, especially his parents. So they went out to a restaurant, they're having this really expensive, lavish dinner, and in fact, his parents had bought a really nice Rolex watch to give to Bart. They give him his Rolex, and they're asking people at nearby tables to take their pictures, and everybody just seems so happy, and the parents are so proud of Bart. And they start making their drive back to Sugar Land, Texas, where the Whitaker residence was. They get back to their house, they pull in the driveway, and Bart's brother and parents make their way up to the front door. Bart is behind them, and he says, "Hey, I forgot something in the car," as his brother and his parents walk into the house and are immediately gunned down by an assassin waiting inside of the Whitaker residence. Bart hears the and runs back inside the house. He sees his family is down. He ends up wrestling with this shooter, who ends up him but hits him in the arm before escaping the house. Police show up, and Bart's brother Kevin has passed away, as well as his mother. They both died on scene. As for Bart and Bart's father, they would go to the hospital and they would both make a full recovery. This huge investigation is launched, and quickly they discovered that Bart Whitaker had hired him. Bart Whitaker wanted his family killed so he could take their money, and he had had the assassin shoot him in the arm to make it look like this was not his fault and he wasn't involved. Here's a picture from the night they were out celebrating Bart's big accomplishment, except Bart was a total liar and he had stopped going to classes ages ago. He was failing every class and was not even close to graduating. In this picture, Bart knows that the assassin he hired is currently sitting in their house. Bart was convicted in 2007 for hiring the hitman and was given the death penalty, but 40 minutes before his execution, the governor of Texas commuted his sentence to a life sentence because, oddly enough, Bart's own father, one of the people he tried to have killed, had forgiven him and did not want to see his last remaining family member be executed. Soon after the Beatles dissolved in 1969, one of the four members, John Lennon, left his native England and moved to New York City. Lennon and his wife, Yoko Ono, took up residence in the Dakota, which is a very famous building that typically houses the rich and famous people of New York. As soon as Lennon moved to New York, he said that he felt relieved because he didn't have to worry about going outside and getting mobbed by a massive crowd of people that were obsessed with the Beatles. There were people that were huge Beatles fans in New York, but they seemed more respectful. Mark David Chapman had always been a massive fan of the Beatles with a particular interest in John Lennon. But after a 1966 interview where John Lennon, off the cuff, said that the Beatles were more popular than Jesus, this soured Chapman's adoration of Lennon. Chapman started referring to Lennon as a poser and said that he espoused virtues and ideals that he himself did not practice. Chapman went from this adoring fan of the Beatles and John Lennon to really solely hating John Lennon and everything he stood for. In 1980, it's safe to say Mark Chapman had become obsessed with John Lennon. Specifically, he had become obsessed with hating John Lennon. In October of 1980, Chapman quits his job as a security guard and flies to New York City. For 2 months, he stayed in the city and didn't really do much of anything. But that would all change on December 8th, 1980. On that day, Chapman went to the Dakota, and he stood right outside the entrance to this building and just waited in hopes that he might run into John Lennon. At 5 p.m. that that day, John Lennon comes out with his wife Yoko Ono, and they walk right past Mark Chapman, who flags them down, and he asks John if he can have his autograph. John still took the time to sign an autograph for Mark Chapman. He was very friendly with Mark and asked him if this is enough. Do you want anything else? And Mark said, no, that's it. That's fine. John and his wife Yoko Ono turned and went into the limousine and they drove away. When the couple got back to the Dakota that night, Mark Chapman had not left. But as soon as they passed Mark and were making their way into the building, Mark Chapman drew a gun and shot John Lennon 4 times in the back. John Lennon staggers into the lobby screaming, I'm shot, before collapsing and dying. And Mark Chapman, he knew what he was doing. He just stood there, put the gun back in his pocket and just waited to be arrested. Chapman's lawyers wanted him to plead insanity, but he refused and instead said, I was totally sane. I knew what I was doing. I chose to shoot John Lennon and I plead guilty. And he was given 20 years to life in jail. And while he was in jail, he would admit that the only reason he did that was to become famous. That was it. This is the picture of Mark Chapman getting that autograph from John Lennon in front of the Dakota just hours before he would him down. In 1932, Charlie Pollard was a 26-year-old farmer living in Macon County, Alabama, where 82% of the population at the time was African American. Many of the other residents in Macon County were completely dirt poor. So when Charlie heard a rumor that the government was going to be coming to town and giving free medical exams to all the African American men, Charlie was thrilled. And so a couple of days later, Charlie got in line and the health service worker told him that today they were just going to be doing a blood test. A couple of days later, the results from the blood test had come in and Charlie was informed that he had bad blood. He was now eligible to join a government-sponsored medical treatment program. He would not only receive medical care for his bad blood, he would also receive free rides to and from the health clinic. He would get a free hot meal on examination days, and in the event he died during the program, his family would be given $50 if they allowed the doctors to perform a thorough autopsy on his body before they buried him. Charlie decided to join the program. About 400 other African American men from Macon County agreed to be a part of the program as well. Less than a year later, men in this program began getting sick. They started developing rashes and sores all over their body. Their bones and joints would ache. They began losing hair. They had indigestion. They had headaches. They had constant fevers. And for some of the men, these symptoms would eventually subside. But for others, they got dramatically worse. They would develop tumors and their bones would start to disintegrate. They would go blind or deaf or become paralyzed, or they would simply die. Then in 1973, so over 40 years after they began this medical program, a very junior assistant within the public health service secretly mailed off all of the records of this Macon County medical program to the Associated Press. And then a couple of days later, the Washington Star newspaper ran this huge story on their front page that said syphilis victims in United States study went untreated for 40 years. Charlie and the other 400 men in this medical program, they didn't have bad blood. What they had was syphilis, a deadly disease that ravages the human body in 3 stages that can unfold over a lifetime. This was not a treatment program. It was a US government-backed medical study of what happens to African American men with syphilis if their condition goes completely untreated for their entire lives. In the 1940s, a cure for syphilis was discovered. They intentionally hid the cure from them and prevented them from getting it. The Public Health Service chose Macon County, Alabama, because at the time, 35% of the population was already infected with syphilis. At least 28 men in the study died as a result of their syphilis infections. Charlie was 66 years old when he heard the news, but fortunately his syphilis had either burned out or gone dormant. Charlie got in touch with a lawyer who eventually sued the federal government, and in an out-of-court settlement, Charlie and the other 73 survivors of the so-called Tuskegee experiment were given $38,000 each as compensation. And then 27 years later, on April 29th, 2000, Charlie passed away at the age of 94. In 2016, a 25-year-old Wall Street banker named Matt was camping near Mount Rainier in Washington State. On the first night, he found a nice clearing in the trees, and so he set up his campsite there. Several hours later, Matt woke up to some strange sounds coming from outside of his tent. Barely unzipped his tent flap, there was a man sitting in front of his fire pit, and this man all of a sudden looks up directly at Matt and makes eye contact with him, and the guy's eyes go wide, and he stands up, turns around, and runs away from Matt's campsite. And so he just quickly quickly unzips his tent, jumps outside, and shines his light into the forest, and he's just left kind of dumbfounded. Finally, the sun came up again, he packed up his campsite, and he began hiking into the forest. And over the next 2 days, he covered at least 10, maybe 15 miles. He found a nice clearing, and he set up another campsite. That night, he set up a fire, and then as he's sitting there, he hears rustling coming from behind him. He hears a man's voice come out of the darkness.
Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?
He knows that even though he can't see him, it has to be the same guy he saw 2 days ago. And so Matt, not knowing what else to do, just says, I don't know where Bell's Canyon is. The voice from the shadows does not come any closer, but instead asks the same question, a bit more forcefully this time.
Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?
He reached down and grabbed his flashlight and shined it, and what he saw was this guy from 2 days ago looking out from behind a tree, and then the silence was broken yet again by this voice.
Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?
His voice was so close to Matt that Matt got scared and raised his light up, and the man was standing just a few feet away from him. And this time, the man's eyes got wide, and he turned around and he ran into the forest again. And so Matt just grabbed his knife and stood in the middle of the campsite. By about 3 in the morning, Matt was so tired that he had to go to sleep. And the sun came up, Matt jumped out of his tent, packed up his stuff, and began practically running in the direction of his car. And then the sun started to go down, and Matt knew he would have to camp out again. But several hours later, he woke up to the sound of somebody walking around his tent. And he knew it had to be this guy. He clutched his knife all night. This guy just walked around his campsite. And then around 4 or 5 in the morning, he scampered off. When the sun finally came up, Matt leapt out of his tent, packed up his stuff, and literally just began running in the direction of his car. And unfortunately, as the sun was setting, he knew he was not going to be able to make it to his car. He had to find a clearing and set up his tent again. And then as he's laying there from somewhere out in the woods,
Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?
and then this guy began running past his campsite, making animal sounds, until the sun finally came up and this guy scampered off back into the woods. Matt didn't waste any time. He leapt out of his tent, packed his stuff up, and ran all the way back to his car. When he finally got inside of his car, he cried tears of joy. He finally flew back to New York, and he just had to accept that there was some strange guy who was able to hunt him over 3 days and 30 miles without the use of a flashlight, without any gear, and all he ever said to Matt was,
Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?
On the afternoon of June 29th, 1934, a 37-year-old police officer named Captain Alan Falby pressed the throttle on his police motorcycle and sped down a street in El Paso, Texas, because he was chasing a speeding pickup truck down the road. The truck he was going after slammed on its brakes and swerved hard to the left. He slammed into the back of this truck, and then he and his bike went sliding across the asphalt for a few seconds, and his motorcycle, his beloved motorcycle, was laying on top of him, and he sees the truck he was chasing. They just drove off, protecting themselves. And he's all alone. Like, there's nobody here to help him, and he's totally stuck. Just then, 2 men from down the road came running up to Captain Falby. And so together, these 2 men were able to lift this heavy motorcycle off of the captain's legs. There was this huge gash in Captain Falby's leg right above his knee that was just pouring out blood. One of them actually noticed that Captain Falby was wearing a necktie. The other man, he ran over to the side of the road where this big tree was, and he got a stick. And so the guy who undid the necktie, he tied it around Captain Falby's leg above the wound, basically cutting off circulation to that wound, a tourniquet. And then the other guy came back over with the stick, and he handed it to the guy with the necktie, and he took the stick and threaded it carefully through the necktie that was now wrapped around the captain's leg, and he began twisting the stick, wrapping up the fabric as he twisted it, which in turn mechanically tightened that tourniquet around the captain's leg. And it ultimately saves Captain Falby's life. In fact, by the time Captain Falby actually got brought to the hospital, and the doctor would tell Captain Falby that, he was about 10 minutes away from death from blood loss. 4 years later, on December 12th, 1938, Captain Falby was back at work when he got a call over the radio about a bad car accident that had happened out on Route 80. And the driver, or who appears to be the driver, is sitting still in the driver's seat, and they were unconscious. He rushes over to the car, and he carefully pulls this unconscious man out of the car, and he sees this guy has a horrible gash in his leg, and it's bleeding profusely. But because this basically mirrored the exact same type of injury that Falby himself had had. He had a necktie and there were sticks on the side of the road. So as quick as he could, he rushed over, grabbed a sturdy stick, took off his necktie, tied it around this man's leg, used the stick to tighten it up even further, and he cut off the bleeding to that wound. And so he's waiting for paramedics to show up and take this guy to the hospital. When he sort of looks at this guy, the man he had just saved was literally the actual same guy who had saved Captain Falby with a DIY tourniquet 4 years earlier. The guy's name was Alfred Smith, and he would make a full recovery. But when he was rushed to the hospital, they would say, you were within about maybe 10 minutes of bleeding to death had it not been for Captain Falby.